discussion, a chance to see other AuthorAID members, sit down with our favorite drink. Today I'm drinking mango juice, and discuss a really important topic in the world of research. Today we're talking about making research relevant to policy, and this is going to hopefully be a really good discussion. And today our expert is Abiodun Egbetokun, and he is a senior lecturer at Montfort University in the UK, with over 2 decades of experience in policy-relevant research. He's had lots of roles in the past. Previously, he was a deputy director of research at Nigeria's National Centre for Technology Management, where he led lots of impactful projects, including Nigeria's first social science research mapping and evaluation of major entrepreneurial education and youth employment interventions. He was also president of the Nigerian Young Academy and a science policy fellow at the US National Science Foundation. He interacts regularly with international and third sector organizations, including UNIDO, GIZ in Germany, I4 Policy and the African Union Commission, and he mentors early career researchers through AuthorAID and also the Development Studies Association. So we're really happy to have him here today talking about making research relevant to policy. A couple of really quick housekeeping bits. I've already said about the fact this meeting is being recorded. Please do introduce yourself in the chat box, because we don't have time for everybody to introduce themselves. Please also ensure that you're muted in the meeting unless we're opening the floor to discussion. So occasionally I may have to mute some people if there's sort of noise or feedback in the background. But apart from that, we'll make sure this is an open discussion where everybody gets a chance to contribute as much as they can. So that's all from me at the moment. I will hand over now to Abiodun to properly start the session.
Yes, thank you very much, Andy, for that kind. And good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you. I've seen in the room a couple of very familiar faces, people whom I know quite well. And yeah, those whom I've worked with in the past. Rada Gimere used to be one of my partners within the AuthorAID network when I started as a mentor. So she was my mentee at that time. So it's good to see you. As Andy said, this afternoon we want to talk about making research relevant to policy. My role is not the role of a speaker, all right? My role is the role of a facilitator this afternoon. The idea is for us to sit down, enjoy ourselves while we have an engaging and hopefully useful conversation about an important topic. This afternoon, I am drinking hot chocolate. Andy is drinking mango juice, right? So let me just explain how this is going to go, how I want us to share this afternoon. I'm going to be asking a series of questions using Mentimeter. If you're not familiar with Mentimeter, it's an online tool for interactive engagements like we're going to have this afternoon. So all you need to do is to go to menti.com, menti.com, and I'm going to show you the code. The front page would ask you to enter a particular code, and that's the code for our session this afternoon, which you will enter. Now, having said all that, can I ask you to do a few things with me? So take a look around you, wherever you're at now, and look at 5 things you can see or notice around you. This could be anything, you know, your cup of drink, your desk, the chair you're sitting on, your computer, anything. Just take a look and then ask yourself, which 4 of these things can I improve right away? So could you move your chair to a better location? Could you shift your computer to be more ergonomically compliant? And so on. Just think about that for a second. Now, slowly take 3 deep breaths. I did mine. I believe you did yours as well. And how does that make you feel? Anyone wants to share in the chat box how that made you feel? Makes me feel better, really. Makes me feel, makes me feel more relaxed. And then I want you to say two positive things about yourself. I can do this. I am a winner. I know that my research is relevant, right? Just tell yourself, you don't have to type that out or say anything. And the final thing I need you to do before we proceed is to indicate one thing you're looking forward to today. I'll be happy if you just type in the chat very quickly, 1 word, 2 words that describe what you hope to take away from this conversation today. I mean, we're all here for very many different reasons. There must be a reason. There must be something you hope to learn from the conversation today. If you just put it in the chat, okay? Just put it in the chat. Also, what are you looking for in the conversation today? What do you hope to do better after the conversation? Yeah, thank you. Modupe wants to learn new things. Would have been nice if you told us some of these new things. Really, it's quite interesting. Amuche, I hope I'm saying the names correctly, wants to talk about linking research into policy. Josan is looking for information. Okay, there's this individual, Zoom user, who hopes to know more about research for impact, about challenges and solutions for research and policy, and several others. Thank you for keeping them coming. Thank you for keeping them coming. So, why don't we dive deep? I mean, like I said, I'm not going to be just talking to you the entire time. I just wanted us to do that to set the context. So there are 3 broad areas in which we're going to discuss this afternoon. At some point, I might be inviting anyone who has 1 or 2 things to share, to unmute themselves and speak. I believe that would be possible. And so, speaking about making research relevant for policy is not a conversation we can finish in 1 sitting. But to be honest, we can make a dent in it by talking about some of the most critical questions that we have as researchers. 3 of them you're looking at on your screen. How can we translate research into policy? How do we ensure that when we do our research, it is first and foremost visible to policymakers? Now, people need to be able to access information before they can use that information. So speaking about policy relevant research, I'm sure many of us would think about, whether policymakers take our piece of research and use it immediately. That's not where it begins. It begins about the research being visible to them. And why is this necessary? And how can we effectively communicate? Okay, so can I ask anyone to share if you've had any experience of doing applied research or policy research or any other kind of research that has influenced policy in one way or another? So a brief success story where you believe that there has been some policy changes due to the research that you did, or where your research was even cited in a policy document, or where you had the opportunity to share your research with policymakers. Feel free to mute yourself and go ahead. If anyone has anything to share. So you...
Okay. Hi, Abiodun.
Yes.
Yeah, my name is Felix. I'm happy to join this session.
Thank you.
So the aspect I would like to share, it's a very important research that we did in my Center for Health and Development at the University of Port Harcourt, based in Nigeria. But the center was a 3-country study. Port Harcourt, Nigeria, Florida, USA, and Ottawa, Canada. And what was the research all about? It was looking into breastfeeding patterns or breastfeeding habits among HIV positive mothers, but Black mothers.
Okay, so
And
Black HIV
yeah,
positive.
HIV positive mothers, but strictly on Black women.
I
Now,
would expect that because we are doing this in Nigeria anyway.
yeah, we're also doing it in Canada and also US.
Ah, right. Okay.
Yeah, so
Okay.
it's a
Right.
3-country study. Yeah, so Nigeria, there is no doubt it will definitely be Black women. But for Canada and US, because of that comparative nature, that's why we had to choose that particular. And the reason why we did that was because, or one of the motivation for this research was to see how we're going to inspire policy, but not really change it. I mean, this thing has been there. Like in Nigeria, they use the WHO policy that a HIV positive mother can do exclusive breastfeeding, not mixed feeding. Exclusive breastfeeding, you're allowed, as long as you are taking your medication, but not in Canada and US. In Canada and US, they have an exception because the government provides free baby milk, so they don't have to be strict on the WHO.
Right. So what did you find, and how did these influence policy?
Okay, well, it has not influenced the policy yet, but it's there for debate. Now, what is showed is Black women living in the US and Canada. Most of them have some challenges with that kind of policy where they don't have the opportunity to breastfeed, especially when they are coming from Africa, especially in Nigeria, where it's a big deal to breastfeed your baby. So you have your mother there with you in the US, in Canada, and she's wondering why you're not breastfeeding your baby. And that puts a lot of psychological strain on these women because the policy differs. And you don't know how to tell your mom, your mother-in-law that came for Omugo, that's a tradition where your mother or your husband's mom come around to say, and you don't know how to tell them that you're not breastfeeding the baby because you are HIV positive. So that puts a lot of psychological strain on the which is what, and some of them end up not being happy. Some of them experience pain. The breast milk is full.
So Femi, which group of policymakers have you shared your findings with?
Healthcare.
Okay.
Healthcare, mainly healthcare workers for now. I mean, they will scale it up. Yeah,
that makes sense. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you.
Amuche is asking a very interesting question that I would like us all to talk about. And in response to this question, feel free to mute yourself, anyone, and have a go. So, does policymakers here mean policy of government alone? So, I'm guessing the question is about whether when we say making research policy relevant, are we speaking only about government policies and government policy makers alone? And because even organizations make organizational policy. So when we say making research policy relevant, let me reframe that question and ask you to, if anyone wants to share, feel free to unmute yourself or you could type in the chat. So when you hear the phrase or when you heard and when you saw the invite for this meeting, what kind of policies did you think we wanted to talk about? Government policies, organizational policies, or just any kind of policy? Another way to put the question is, when you do research, what kind of policies do you want to influence? If anyone wants to share, you can unmute yourself. So I see Joshua is saying government policies, Olufemi government policy, Zoom user, any kinds of policies. I'm curious to know who Zoom user is. Rada is saying government policy, government policy, government policy. So, Amuche, to answer your question, from what I'm seeing in the chat, it seems that there is an overwhelming impression within the research community that when we talk about connecting our research to policy, we're talking about government policy. But you make a very, very important point. Policies exist across many different levels. The reason why we talk much more about government policies is because these are quite broad-based, right? They affect a massive number of people at the same time. So imagine if AuthorAID has its own organizational policy. How many people is it going to affect? I mean, I bet some people were hearing about AuthorAID for the first time when they saw the advert for these events, right? So they probably stand no chance of doing anything that influences AuthorAID's policy. So smaller level policies are a bit, narrower in scope. And this is why most researchers focus on influencing government policy. But I do agree that we can begin to talk about policies at organizational level, policies at the workplace, and so on and so forth. I guess it's more a question of what we want to do as researchers. What level of influence do we want to operate in? Here's an example from myself of a project that we did some years back. I've seen a couple of, at least one of the team members for this project in the call. Now, this picture you're looking at here with microphones and headphones is not, we're not in the studio to record music. We were in the studio with a director in one of the organizations that were the users of our research. In fact, I would say the organization that was the main user of the research. We did an impact evaluation, and here is the director of the program that we evaluated. Now, what we ensured we did was to carry them along from the beginning. And so it was easy for us to interact with them along the line. This picture of the gentleman holding a phone to his ear is the cover of our policy report. And this at the bottom, this rider at the bottom is a testimonial that we got from the organization of how our research impacted them. So there is no gainsaying the fact that our project, this is what they call it, has positively impacted the development of their own program. And they went on to list, a lot of benefits. At this point, allow me to make two suggestions. You see, as researchers, there are two things I think will be helpful. One of the ways you can monitor your own impact is a new tool called Sage Policy Profiles. I'm putting that in the chat box now. If you've not been looking at it, you want to take a look at it. What they do is to collect data on the basis of how frequently research publications are cited in policy documents. It's not perfect, but I think it's a good start to look at. Now, the second point is if after you have done your research is when you want to begin to speak to policymakers, you are late. And I think this reasoning should underlie what we do. A lot of donors now ask for impact pathways or impact plan when you submit research proposals to them. In the UK, where I work currently, there's a big discussion now around impact case studies. So as universities, you claim to do a lot of research with government funding. Every year, every 4 years, 5 years, there is what they call the Research Excellence Framework, where they assess what you have done. And then part of your submission as a university must be impact case studies that detail how your research has influenced policy. What I found from my experience is that even universities scramble to find meaningful impact case studies. And you know why? Because as researchers, many times we operate like somebody who has a hammer, and to him, every problem looks like a nail. So we don't care whether the problem requires a screwdriver or not, but because we have a hammer, we know how to run regressions, we know how to run FGDs, we have knowledge about one or the other issue. We just go ahead and do research anyway, not necessarily talking to potential end users. Chukwuemeka, thank you very much. Industries also need policies, and they also make policy as well. So I'd like to move on from this groundwork that we have laid, and let's have a quick chat about the necessity of making research policy relevant. Why do you think it's necessary? So let me invite you to go to menti.com. If you cannot, access Menti readily, you can put your responses to this. This is a bit tricky to put the response in the chat, but you can try if you can. So go to menti.com. The welcome screen will ask you for a code. Put in 22347385. Or if you're in front of your computer and you have your mobile device with you, you can just scan the QR code. And what I would like us to reflect on is, what do you think policymakers mostly use research evidence for? What do you think policymakers mostly use research evidence for? The code is 22347385.
Hello.
Yes, please.
Okay, first of all, I'm very happy to having this opportunity, and thank you for having me. And why policymakers mostly they depend on research evidence for is, when policymakers use the research evidence is where there is a problem, and anytime the problem should be find out for the solution. That means sometimes the research the problem itself is the sort of the solution. So that is why the research is very relevant. And apart from this, the policymakers sometimes they use and also they find for an option to find or to provide a solution depend on the research evidence, and the relevancy of the research evidence is very important, and also the value of research evidence is very important. So they compare each other, this evidence, they evaluate, they give value to give a policy decision, and also just to serve for policy committee or the governments.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You didn't say your name, so I wasn't sure who was speaking, but I wanted us to focus on the Menti for a minute. And then we'll get back to having this chat. But you make very great points here. They are complementary, both government policies and other kinds of policies, and what we do as researchers and what policymakers should do. The responses they're quite interesting. And thank you, Andy, for putting the link in the chat. I pasted it somewhere and then I lost it. So I tried to type, but it didn't work. Thank you. So what do you think policymakers mostly use research evidence for? In terms of ranking, this is a question where you're supposed to rank in the order in which you think they are important. Now, it turns out that initializing action and forming opinions are some of the top options here. Let me tell you what I think. On the basis of research, did anyone see this coming? Let me know if you saw this coming. There's a study published in 2019. I was part of that study. It was a massive crowdsourced study. And part of the literature review in that study looked at some previous studies and other, legislative analysis, specifically in the case of the US. But if this would be different in your country, please feel free to let us know. But it does say that the predominant use of research in US congressional committees. Now, what that means is, if we speak strictly about politicians now, the politicians in parliament, in the National Assembly, or in Congress, the major reason they use research, or the major purpose for which they use research, is not contrary to what we think, to initialize action. It is not contrary to what I'm looking at on the Menti here, to increase their knowledge, but more about, and it's not even to form opinions. This is what the research says. They've already formed their opinion. They already know what they want to do, right? They use it mostly for rhetorical ammunition. What do you take away from this? I'd like one or two persons to speak to this, please. What do you take away from this? The research says that, at least in the US, and again, like I said, maybe this is different across countries. I expect it to be different, but what do you think? Policymakers mostly use research for rhetorical ammunition. So they have a position. They are looking for research that supports their position rather than looking for research to inform the position or to form an opinion. What do you think? Have you seen this in practice before? Yes, please go ahead. Please say your name.
This is Michael.
Michael. Yes, thank you. Go ahead.
From the experience also in Africa, let's forget the developed countries now. I think this is because they've already made up their mind most times, and that is why most times you see them not supporting research, because they've already made up their mind about what they want to do. And I'm not surprised that that is also the case of US, because I expected that US should do better, actually. But for us in this part of the world, where politicians are mostly not interested in research, and that is why you see some of our research institutes not doing well. They hardly support research. So that means they feel we don't have anything to actually contribute to their decision making. So I'm not really surprised that they do it for rhetorical ammunition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. Nino, yes, thank you, Andy. Nino, please go ahead and mute yourself.
Thank you. I chose actually the same reason for two or more things. One, given the definition of what a policymaker is, I think it varies across. And if we're to go by, let's say, Ugandan context, I'm from Uganda, the decision to okay policy is usually at the hands of the politicians. So most times it tends to be incremental in nature. Unless there is something that you're going to do that interests the politicians, or that is going to increase their in terms of if they want to consolidate power, then they will pick on that. But basically, what will happen is whatever research you present to them, just to get the general knowledge of what is happening, in order to either increase their position or assert their position. At least for my case, from a political point of view, or in terms of those who are mandated to, to officialize the policy itself, let's say the legislature, they will never rely on a policy that is likely to undermine the question of power, their influence on power. So for that reason, I usually say they will only get it just to get a picture of what is happening. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mino. Charles, you're making a number of very good points here. Do you want to unmute yourself and speak to this? Charles, are you there? That's Charles Kalinzi. If you are speaking, we cannot hear you. Charles, we can't hear you. I'm guessing that.
I believe you are basing on the comments in the chat to raise this.
Yeah, so I mean, the Charles' point was, does this point mean that we predetermine research outcomes? And I was responding, I don't think so. So even when research findings differ, I think the broader question then is, does that mean that we as researchers should be looking for the politicians who agree with us to fund our research? Well, I really want us to move away from this point to another very important point, which is how then can we disseminate our research effectively to stakeholders? And I think as we go along, that very important question that you raised, Andy, will be answered as as we go along. So
Yeah, there are two hands up at the moment.
Okay.
Ayodeji and Belema.
Yes, Ayodeji and Belema, if you can make your point quickly, and then we can move on to the question of identity. In that sequence, Ayodeji first, and then Belema. I hope I'm saying the name correctly. Ayodeji, if you are speaking, we cannot hear you. Can anyone hear him?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yeah, we can hear you
Okay.
now.
Yes, the point I wanted to make actually, it overlaps with the question you just raised. And I want to pick it from the angle of there's an approach that we apply in my field. I'm a plant breeder, and there's a concept we call participatory plant breeding. Is applicable in some other sections of agricultural research. And we have come to discover that when we do participatory agricultural research, it tends to enhance the adoption of whatever technology we want to come up with. And participatory research starts with those that we end up using it at the end of the whole process. So taking it from that angle, I am looking in the direction of how is it possible for us to have an arrangement whereby, as a researcher, if I want to start a research, part of those who I consider on the value chain of that research are the policy makers, such that while I am trying to reach out to maybe the local people, the common man, I also have access to the policy makers, who of course they are important stakeholders, so that their opinions can also be taken along while I go back to my research field or lab, so that at the end of the day, after I've come up with my discovery, since they were involved in the process at the beginning, it will make it a bit easier for them to, be carried along with the process of adopting it. So that is the point I want to make.
Thank you very much. That's a very important point. Belema, before I try to wrap up on this point, I saw your hand has gone down now, so maybe.
Yeah. Hello, please, am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah, so I wanted to make a contribution to the points that was being discussed. What's like the concept that came out of that, contrary to what we think, the policymakers in the US do not really use research findings to initiate policies and other stuff and take actions, but rather they use it as rhetoric ammunition. Yeah. And I think it basically happens almost everywhere, in industry, in politics, everywhere. And it's the fact that whatever research finding you are doing, it's just like if we test ourselves. Please, am I still audible?
Yes,
I can hear.
Go ahead. We can hear you. We can hear you.
The point basically is, I even think for researchers, we do something similar as well. When we have a point we want to prove, we just want to find the research that has been done around that area, just to add up to whatever we are doing. So it's not as if we need the research to inform the decision we are making. It's not like we need the research to take the particular action. We just need to persuade somebody that has to hear whatever we are saying. So basically, I think it cuts across even in our African continent as well, and even within the research community too.
Thank you very much, Ben Lama. So moving away from that point, I think we're heading somewhere with these, and I think we are all on the right path to getting there. So Charles made the point in the chat that it's hard politicians say they customize the research evidence just to support their position. And Gebeyehu, this is exactly what we want to talk about now. One of the things we want to ensure that we do as researchers is, to make sure that it has long-term impact. But the truth is we cannot do that unless we have the right identity. And I think the point made by Ayodeji earlier is a point we will return to. Hopefully we'll have time for that, which is about how to ensure that policymakers are included from our research starting from the design stage. I alluded to this when I shared my own experience of policy influence earlier, that we co-created the project with the organization. So there is no, in fact, there is almost zero chance that they will not be interested in the outcome. And I think this is very, very important. There's a particular tool I'm going to share shortly, the power influence or power interest matrix, which I'm assuming that some of you in the call might be aware of, but just for the sake of relevance. Now, regarding identity, there's one thing that we have to quickly do that I believe we should do as researchers. So let's do a quick test of that. And it is being able to tell very, very quickly, to communicate very quickly, very rapidly what we do. So I'm going to count from, go ahead with the Menti, it's the same one. This is just the next question in the Menti. The same code, 22347385. You can either scan the QR code or go to menti.com and use the code. The link was in the chat earlier. I believe we still have it there. Andy, could you please post that link again, just so that it's closer to the current location, yes, for everyone to join. Which policy area does your research primarily impact? As a researcher, can you give that answer in one word or two words? Does anyone want to unmute and say that quickly? Which policy area does your research primarily impact?
Yeah, this is my turn.
Yes.
Yeah,
one word, not a sentence.
Yeah, okay. All right. Industry, actually, from my study.
Okay. Modupe says health. I'm guessing we're having an issue with the Menti because I'm not seeing any response there, but we can go on anyway. So industry, health. Anyone else wants to? We'll talk education. Okay. Now this is your
environmental.
Yes, environment,
Education.
Agriculture and food security, irrigation, right? Did I hear that correctly? So the point here is that we as researchers need to be able to communicate our identity, marketing and management. Oh, okay, I'm seeing the responses now. Yeah, and this is interesting. Think about how long it took you to come up with that response. The longer it takes, the less likely you will be able to sustain attention, especially when you want to speak to policymakers. One thing we have to admit is, especially nowadays, nobody has time, more so policymakers, all right? Now, there is the notion of what is called elevator pitch, which is what I want us to take a look at very quickly. Right, so it's interesting really that we seem to be in a group of people who know what they are doing. This is probably a self-selected audience. Okay, so I want you to imagine that you're a world-class researcher in the top 1% globally.
Researcher in the top 1 globally in your discipline.
In your discipline. Yep. So just imagine that, all right? And ask yourself, what knowledge, skills, attributes, and attitude would you possess as someone in the top 1% globally in your discipline? Okay? You don't have to tell me that. This is just for us to reflect. Okay? What knowledge, skills, attributes, and attitudes would you have as someone in the top 1% globally in your discipline? Have you ever wondered why it's always the same name you hear in the news all the time? So when it comes to think about any area in your country, so the news is on about some flooding somewhere and how this could have been caused by climate change. Usually when the newscasters when the news house would quote some researcher, they always rotate the same set of names. Why? It's about visibility. These are the guys they know. When policymakers would invite people to their assembly, so say whether it's at the organizational level or, at the national level, usually it's the same group of people that are getting rotated. These are the visible ones. Okay? So what knowledge, skills, attributes, and attitudes would you possess as a member of the elite in your discipline? And then the question is this. This is one takeaway that I think we should all, an area where I think we should all try to improve. What do you need to do to become that person? Answer that question in your little notebook by the side. And then we can move on to talk about communication. All right? Now, let me ask for your input here. How likely is it for a policymaker to access each of the following? Again, the same Menti that we were using, or if you feel more comfortable typing in the chat. A journal article, a newspaper article, a blog post, a news feature, either on the TV, on the radio, or anything on social media. How likely do you think it is for a policymaker to access these things? Interesting. This is interesting. So it will seem, based on the very few responses so far, it will seem that news feature is a clear winner, right? Let's see if we can collect a few more responses. Ladies and gentlemen, what do you think? How likely? Now note that the word there is not big, okay? And the word there is not use. It is how likely is it for a policymaker to access any of these things? A journal article, a newspaper article, a blog post, a news feature, on TV, on radio, it doesn't matter, electronic media generally, and something on social media. So it is between newspaper article and news feature. That's really quite interesting. Okay, I don't think we have any response to this in the chat. So yeah, we can rely on the Menti entirely for this. So question, as a researcher, so let's reflect on this together. If we know, right, that a policymaker is more likely to access a newspaper article, more likely to access the news feature, either on TV or radio. Why then don't we do more of this? The fundamental, in fact, by an overwhelming, by a landslide, I should say, by a landslide, okay? The number one research output that we produce as researchers is journal articles. I do understand that this is also partly about incentives, all right? But in the context of our conversation this afternoon, ensuring that our research is policy relevant, we have to communicate it in a way that we get to the right audience. Okay? Thank you very much, George. That's a very, very important question. Don't policymakers have analysts to inform them? We're coming to that in a minute. I'm aware, I'm also trying to mind the time. So if we do know for a fact that newspaper articles, news features seem to be more attractive to policymakers, then why don't we just do more of this? A couple of months ago, I was talking to some colleagues somewhere, and here's what I told them. The data says that 82% of articles published in the humanities are not cited once, even by other researchers. And of those that are cited, only 20% have been read. We did some studies of Nigerian legislators years ago, and about 60% of them concluded that they consider, publications that we write, as academics, too technical. Now, here's an interesting bit, partly in response to your question, George. In many countries, there are dedicated offices that support government policymakers. In the Nigerian system, we have what is called NILDs, That's the National Institute for Legal and Democratic Studies. They are supposed to do research to support the National Assembly, that's the House of Representatives, and the Senate. In the UK, it is called POST, Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology. Okay. Now, one of the things we might need to do, and I think this is a question of personal responsibility as researchers, is to find out where this office is in our country and engage. It's a question of responsibility. And I agree with the point that it's about incentives. What kinds of incentives do we need as researchers to do more of these things? I think that's probably
talking earlier about the popularity.
This is a video that, you know, I won't let play now because of the time. Now, challenges. Why is it difficult for us to link research to policy? We've talked about the problem of incentive, especially for those who work in universities. You won't get promoted. Well, yeah, I was just about to say it, Ayodeji. You won't get promoted and appraised except if it's based on journal articles. But I think the goalpost is shifting nowadays. There's more and more emphasis on visibility. Okay. Now, in that spirit, I'll invite you to let's have a quick discussion about challenges in making research relevant to policy. Still the same mentee we are using, now a different question. So just type it in. You can type up to 5 challenges that you think. What are some of the key challenges? Or if you want to unmute and share maybe some challenges that you have faced in the course of your work, that's also okay. What are some of the key challenges? We've talked about the fact that policymakers many times have made up their mind before seeking the research. We've talked about the incentives system within our organizations. What other challenges can you think of? Does anyone want to? Policymakers not available. I'll be keen to understand a bit more what that means. Communication gap. Vivian, communication gap. Vivian, correct me if I'm wrong. So does that mean something along the lines of the data in the chat? I mean, in the slide that I showed earlier, where policymakers generally, especially those from the political side, generally consider research output too complicated for them to understand. Vivian, is that right? Overwhelming, speed, too technical, jargon, no time, lack of translation skill. Sadiat says communication to non-academic audience is a skill that most academics lack. George highlighted time misalignment and the research versus policy processes. George, I'm interested in this, and I believe we can all learn from this. Do you want to unmute and explain what you mean by research versus policy processes?
Yes, I can quickly mention what I mean by that is that
yes.
When policies are being made, they follow different kind of timelines, and research follows a different kind of timeline. Sometimes policy needs evidence immediately, but then maybe there's no research for that, or research is outdated and needs to be updated. And the whole process of research takes much more time than what might be needed for policy. So there's always these mismatches of time during the different processes, because policy making process follows a different timeline with different actors, and research process also follows a different timeline and different actors.
All right, thank you very much. Ayodeji, please go ahead. But just before you speak, that's a very important point that you just made, Gebiye, and I think it speaks to what we saw in the previous mentee. Policymakers struggle to understand some of the things that we write. So why don't we write more of the things that they will understand? So I think one challenge that I would hope that we will all take away from this conversation today is that in addition to our research articles, we want to write more things that are potentially more visible to policymakers. For example, over the last couple of years, I've written several newspaper pieces based on my research articles. So this is not substituting for our research publications, right? And usually they are very short. And to be honest, these are things that you talk about over a cup of coffee. If you just convert those things to 800 words, 1,000 words, there are hundreds of platforms out there where you can share this. The conversation, AuthorAID has a blog, that hosts articles that support other researchers and so on and so forth. You can reach out to news houses. Many times they are looking for news. Okay, so Ayodeji, please. Ayodeji, if you are speaking, we cannot hear you. Or did you put down your hand now?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Talking.
Yes, please.
Can you hear me now?
Go ahead. Yes.
All right. Thank you. I recognize then somebody that made a contribution about writing of policy briefs. I think that's very important. I think there was one workshop or training course conducted by AuthorAID, that should be in 2021, 2022. And I think during that course, something of that nature was mentioned. So, of course, if you can have such a kind of course being repeated for some of us to still participate in and learn from. But speaking in another direction, I heard you mention about NILS, that institution in Abuja that serves as an organ to advise the National Assembly. And yes. I think that kind of institution, it's important for that kind of institution to be co-opted into the structure of NUC Tech Fund. Now, Tech Fund and NUC, these are organs that sorry, I'm talking as a Nigerian anyway. These are organs that
specific situation, Ayodeji.
Yes.
Do you mind
I'm looking at.
Yeah, do you mind if I say that we have a chat about that afterwards? I mean, that not because it's not relevant, but just because it's very, very highly specific to the case of Nigeria. So, for example, POST, which is the Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology, performs similarly to NILS in Nigeria. But what POST does is that they have a weekly newsletter that they send out to researchers. You only need to go to their website and subscribe to that. And every week, as part of that newsletter, the bulletin includes specific policy areas in which they are currently, the parliament is currently accepting referendum and memoranda and input funding. And I mean, you can just put up your research, support them. All right. Now, Andy has graciously provided a link to the course on writing and research communication that Ayodeji referenced to. That would be useful. And Johnson, Sage is the name of the publishing house. I'm not sure if it does have a full meaning. If it does, I don't know it. I just know it as Sage Publishers. So I was referring to Sage Policy Briefs. If you put that into Google Scholar, you will find it. I think we're almost out of time now before Andy comes to kick me out. Let's go to the last bit that I think we should talk about. So I wanted us to share this, but I think we can reflect on it as we begin to wrap up. I think the use of clear language, concise language, as Gebeyehu is saying, is very, very important. The ability to write concisely in a non-conventional manner, as if we're not talking to co-researchers, I think is very, very important. This is the point where I wanted to go back to this slide that I showed earlier.
Talking earlier about the popularity of research. There's some data here that says 82% of articles published in the humanities are not even cited once. And of those that have been cited once, only 20% have actually been read. Correct me if I'm wrong. How many times have you cited papers that that you didn't read. Everybody does it, right? So the fact that the paper has been cited does not mean it has been read. So I don't want to say nobody reads research, but we will be in an echo chamber if all we do as researchers is to just publish research articles. We're just talking to each other. Talking earlier about.
Thank you very much. So I'm tempted for us to go on because this is an interesting conversation, but I will leave it here. One key actionable takeaway is that as researchers, we need to begin to work much more on digestible evidence, concise summaries, policy briefs, infographics. Policymakers do appreciate these things a lot. So I want you to reflect on what you would do differently from today. What new skills are you going to learn as a result of this conversation? And how are you going to support others? On that note, Andy, I would hand it back over to you for the formal closing formalities.
Okay, thank you very much, Abiodun, and thanks everyone who's contributed as well. It's a really interesting discussion, and some good resources that were mentioned as well. I think there was another resource you mentioned as well, Abiodun, I wanted to pick up on. Was it the power influence matrix or something like that? Yes. Could you put that in the chat box as well for people that are interested? I think it's sort of a stakeholder analysis type tool, wasn't it?
It's in my last slide, actually.
Okay.
It's in my last slide. I just thought we didn't have enough time, but I can show that while you speak.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, just so we keep looking at it while you speak.
Yeah, so we're just finishing off really. Just a couple of housekeeping things. We will share the recording of this session to everyone that registered. The recording will be available on the AuthorAID YouTube channel as well. Yes, there we go. So I don't quite see the top of the screen. What's the name of this tool again?
Is the power interest matrix.
Yeah, power interest matrix, yeah.
Or you could call it power influence matrix.
Yes. Great. That's just one of the many tools that you can use in influencing policy. Fantastic. Right, thank you very much. And one last thing I want to do is to try and do a group photo if we can. So what we'd like to do is if everyone's able to turn their cameras on, this is just so we can take a snapshot of everyone that joined today, at least those of you who are able to switch your camera on just for a moment. And apologies, I know that it costs it costs internet data to do this, but just for a moment, I'll see some familiar faces.
Yeah,
it's good to see faces because if you have a username like Zoom user.
Yeah, and Zoom user was very engaging actually. That's quite interesting.
Yeah. Right, I'm just going to change my screen so I can see everybody. Let's do 25 participants, and then we can do. Okay, so I've got enough people on screen to do a screenshot. So if everyone wants to smile and wave.
Smile for the camera and wave.
Okay, and I've got a snapshot there. There we go, brilliant. Thank you very much, everyone.
And by the way, Andy, just before we go, Johnson was asking in the chat if the slides will be shared.
Yeah, if you're able to, if you could forward, I think you've already forwarded them, haven't you, to my colleague Asta. Could you also, would you also be able to share the results of that Menti? There was a Menti question and the results were really small. I couldn't quite see what it said.
I will do that.
Yeah.
I'll do that.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, and we'll definitely share those and the video clip and the video recording of the session today.
Excellent.
Oh, apologies, I didn't respond to you, Joshua. Good to see you. See some familiar names and faces, and I didn't have a chance to respond to the chat. But thank you, everyone. And thanks, Abiodun, and thanks for everyone that responded in the discussion. And have a great rest of the Friday and a great weekend.
Thank you, everyone. It's been interesting. I mean, the conversation could go on and on, but we have to get on to other things at some point, right?
Yeah, great topic.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.